Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Yeah, definitely. So this is a different topic for you all, and I do understand that. And first of all, I'd like to thank thinkLA for having me here today. Really exciting to have this group together, and also exciting to see this large of a group interested in automotive. I'm from Detroit, and growing up in this industry, it's one of these industries that, you know, it's so passionate, but at the same time, having your family from it, growing up in it, I've worked for Ford, I've worked for Jaguar Land Rover, I've worked for Ferrari. There's so much to this industry and so many different angles. And you know, just to get to know who's speaking to you today, my passions in this industry have always been alternative fuels, what direction that's going in, and really how to make the retail experience better. And we look out in this crowd, that's what you really see is a lot of people trying to make the retail experience better for consumers. So it's exciting times. I've had the fortune of running a market intelligence company for the past 4.5 years. And what we're really focused on are two major areas. One is how you build these vehicles, what's in the vehicles, how they're priced. And the other side of it is kind of automotive incentives. We've been really getting into that. So I went to my team, and you know, we're playing around with different ideas of what to talk to you guys about today. And you know, we're talking about cross-device, how it's actually coming into the car now. And you guys probably have that covered. You know, there's a lot of cool stuff that George was showing. I think that what Apple's doing now and Google is really amazing and huge steps. But what we thought would be interesting for you would be automotive incentives. Is this a clicker? Right? Okay. So we thought automotive incentives would really be interesting to you. So what we're going to try to do today, I won't be able to get into the weeds of this topic, but I'm going to try to talk to you guys from 3 different lenses. The brands, the dealers, and also the customers that are involved in purchasing the vehicles. So I'd like to baseline everyone and go to really, traditionally going back in time, this is how an auto transaction occurred. What you would have is you'd have a MSRP, which is set by the brands. You would then have an invoice price at the bottom. That used to be about between 10 and 15% below MSRP. And then you'd have what the dealer would negotiate with the customer. What the dealer kept was their commission. What the customer got was a car. They'd drive away, end of transaction. Now, what happened over time as we got into the 70s and 80s, competition got really rough. And George had a great slide up earlier, which was fantastic because it leads right into this. The price of a car is trying to creep up, but really the income's not getting there. So these cars are really expensive to make. You know, they take 5 years to produce. The companies all put a lot of time and effort into this. 5 years go by, maybe they produce too many, and this started happening really in the 70s and 80s. So what happened is the introduction of the rebate. There's a guy named Lee Iacocca who used to run, at the time, Chrysler. He introduced buy a car, get a check. That was the most famous rebate that was out there at the time. So as the 80s went on, really, the rebates started kind of stacking in, and they were just kind of targeted. They would just come in every now and then. They weren't really happening on a regular basis. But what happened over time is we got into the 90s, and the lease showed up. So people started leasing their vehicles on a regular basis. I'll talk about a little bit about millennials. They seem to be loving leases, and that's great because it's a way of transacting on a vehicle and really not having to get into a long-term commitment with it. So the lease really came in, and then some major economic events occurred. The major economic events were the first stock market crash, 9/11, second stock market crash, and then really kind of brings us up to where we are now. And during that time, what happened is these targeted incentives, which were just kind of coming in and out, became a chronic part of the industry. So basically now, oops, went the wrong way. Thank you. Right now, there's 2 kind of incentive groups that are out there. One are customer-facing, and these are the incentives that you'll see out there. You'll see these online. So these are where I'll go on banner ads. This is what you'll see in the newspaper. These are what the tier 1s put out, or banks, and they're really just showing what a lease deal is and really what the rates are, the APRs and things like that. Now, more interesting for this group there are what are also called non-public or basically private incentives. These incentives are the ones that are basically between the OE, the brand, and the dealer group. They never really make it. The top example, well, kind of. The top example is actually one I found online where you can actually see that a dealer actually put out what are behind-the-scenes cash programs that sometimes make it into some advertising. The bottom example is called a stair-step program. This is something you'll never see publicly displayed. This basically shows by the number of vehicles that are sold on a monthly basis, a kind of extra commission or an extra dollar amount that the manufacturer will give the dealership. So when you're looking at transaction information, if you see like average transaction price right now is $31,000, that does not include the stair-step program. So stair-step program, basically those dollars could either go directly into the dealer's pocket or could end up into the transaction. So kind of give you some scale as to why you guys might be interested in this. On the left side here, you have what the total spend this year will be on digital. And that's $7.3 billion, and that's great because it shows digital is growing. It's projected to grow for the next 5 years, and that's awesome because it's showing that car companies are going the right direction of how to get advertising out there. On the right-hand side, that number is $42 billion. That's a conservative estimate of how much that the U.S. auto industry is spending on consumer incentives just this year. Now that's also forecasted to grow. So as sales are going up, we're trying to push MSRP up. What's happening is that incentives are becoming a bigger part of the transaction. So at least for the near-term future, they're going to be a big part if you're trying to talk to a final consumer. So I want to give you guys an example of if there's only two things you take out of this when you're talking about incentives, there's complexity and there's stackability. First, I'm going to talk about complexity, which is basically how many incentives there are out there. We took basically just a random program on a pretty high volume vehicle. And what we don't want to do is talk about any brands today, so we don't want to pinpoint anyone. They pretty much, to the most part, have the same behavior. Some are better than others. But what we found is that on this particular vehicle, there's 22 incentives on this vehicle right now that are offered on a national basis. So if I'm sitting here in LA, and I have a friend in Miami and a friend in Phoenix, and we're on the phone, and we have basically access to all this information, we'll be able to talk about these 22 programs. Now, if we just go to the Western region, that jumps to 37 programs. So our friend in Miami has now a different set of incentive programs than we have just within this region. So the 37 programs I can still talk to my friend in Phoenix about. Now we're in LA County, there's 41 incentives on this vehicle. That means I'm starting to shop for a vehicle, and there's 41 different incentive groups that I could get on this vehicle today. Now, the thing is, I have no visibility to this. So I went to my team. We're not a creative company. So I went to my team and asked them to put together kind of a example of what happens when a transaction occurs with a person going through. So they came back to me with Joe. So Joe goes out there and he starts to look for a vehicle. He doesn't know this, but there's 41 programs out there for him. So Joe's out there. He's probably in the Silver Lake area by his pants. He's moving across. All of a sudden, he starts looking at things. He's a member of Costco. There's affinity programs. Is he buying a different make? Is he loyalty? Is he non-loyalty? What are the open offers nationally he can see? So he's starting to piece this stuff together, doing a lot of research online. Now, there's a lot of great third-party sites right now, and those are really starting to put a lot of exposure onto this, but they really don't get all 41 programs out there. So Joe is now kind of stumbling through. He's a college student. Dealer tells him that's something we can work with. He decides he's going to go between finance, lease, and cash. He's going to finance this vehicle, and he lives in Los Angeles, California. So he gets his 0% APR, 0% APR, 36 a month, and $2,000 cash back. So he went from 41 programs that he didn't know about down to 3. And what I'll get to at the end, as we're talking about, is this is real opportunity of, from a communications standpoint with what digital firms can do, and also from a dealership standpoint and from a brand standpoint, how we can work together to help these customers out. So basically, when we think about these three different angles, again, the brands, the dealers, and the final customer, there's a lot you can take away from this. The brands themselves are built just to do that. They're built to protect and to build a brand. They're built to build cars. They're not in the incentives business per se. Now they get dragged into it. So when you look at your tier 1 advertising, which I'll talk about in a second, it's definitely there. But when it comes to the core of what a brand wants to do, they don't want to cheapen their own product. The dealers themselves, they've got a completely different challenge. They've got multiple brands that they're representing now. So some of the larger dealer groups have national dealerships. They're doing brands all across. So they'll represent Chrysler, Ford, GM. If you're a salesperson right now in digital, and let's say you're working at Yahoo, you don't represent Facebook, I don't think, right? these guys are doing that. So what they're doing is they're playing their cards all across the industry. And that is an inherent challenge also for the OEs. How do they interact with these guys? How can you basically get the information from your core down to your salespeople? And then finally, there's the customer. Really, when it comes down to the customer only can see what they can find. So if a lot of this is hidden, they're only going to find out what they can find out through like a TrueCar, an Edmunds, or potentially going to the brand sites. So let's talk about Tier 1 a little bit, because Tier 1, again, is mostly going to be a brand messaging. A lot of money is put into that when they do launches of vehicles. They'll have maybe something like this on a tagline where you'll see $299 a month, 24 months, $19.99 due at signing. That's a pretty typical thing. So where's that going to go? From this perspective, you can definitely do banner ads. You can get it out on TV. The traditional spaces work. There's some opportunity here of starting to get into this conversation to find out where they're going. Where the real opportunity starts is at the Tier 2 and Tier 3 level. Now you're starting to kind of come into insight. Now the same deal is here, but what you might not see is that there's an ad group now that's going into this deal. So while the same deal is there, it actually costs more money, because for them to actually place the media, they're probably using Tier 3 co-op funds. And to do that, the dealer normally has to dip into their pocket and then get matched by the OE. So this is an extra cost just to get to the same deal. Complexity increases. There's more programs. And then finally, you get down to Tier 3. Now, Tier 3, you'll get a military, college graduates, friends and family, such and such. Deal comes down $50. And this I think, is where the biggest opportunity is within this group, is really how can we get the communication from the brands and dealers down to the digital firms to actually get this message out there. So when we're thinking about this also, I guess like when I was talking about this with a lot of people before I came in to understand your space a little bit better. And what came up a lot is from an attribution standpoint and bringing people into the fold, the more you can actually pre-qualify people before they actually get into this buying behavior, I think they'll actually have access to a lot of the incentives information. For example, if you just look at demographic data, you might think that someone that lives in a certain area, makes the same dollar amount, likes to drive pickup trucks, will pay the same amount of money. It turns out that they won't. Some people are just very into vehicles and will pay more, and other people will pay less. It's called elasticity on their purchase. So the more that this group can actually help find out what is that elasticity, where's this person, do they just want to buy a product and get a great service at a dealership? Do they want to skip the dealership completely, go buy it through Costco? I think the more this group can actually bring it in, what you'll do is you'll help reduce the complexity of the messaging from the brands down to the dealers, down to the customer. And I think there's a lot of money in it also. I think that if you can bring that $42 billion down, it's something that can happen over time, and it happens through a really great customer experience, which right now, I think that as time goes on and we start to really target these things, targeted deals are really the way to do that. So I was actually shortened today a little bit also, and I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions if anyone has any. Does anyone have any questions? That's a great question. So the question was, do all manufacturers use the same calculation for co-op funds? And from my experience, the answer is no. And it really can even differ from the region you're sitting in and the dealer group you're dealing with. There's a lot of things that go into that, from the relationship that the manufacturer has on the franchise agreement with the dealer, and they can tier those out. But in general, yeah, the answer is no. Yeah, so the question is there any data on basically take rate of incentives of how they stack together and what's actually being used in the marketplace? The lease rates are creeping up right now. Luxury normally has the highest lease rate penetration. So the luxury vehicles are creeping up between, I think, north of 50%, getting close to 60%, and for some brands. On average, it's about 45% though for a lease. And for the cash that's actually being used, it really depends on, if you're going to an APR contract, that's where the cash really goes, and then actually buying down the deals. So the percentage of cash is really in that other kind of 60% of the deals that go through. And then, then it comes down to, do you come into any of these other categories like military or, like a college graduate, things like that. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, when there's dealer cash or customer cash, what actually passes through to the final customer? So technically, if it's called customer cash, 100% should pass through to the customer. If it's dealer cash, you're in a gray area. and the dealer cash goes to the dealership for the most part. A lot of the OEs will do the best they can to communicate that or to encourage their dealers to communicate that to the final customer, but right now, technically, the dealer could keep that. I'd say the good dealers, there's a lot of really good dealers out there, and I'd say overall, it's a hit or miss situation. When it comes down to it, one thing that one of my friends asked me to bring up is, it really is true, when you buy a car at the end of the month, you get a better deal. And when you're buying a car at the end of the month, they're going to throw everything at you. The margins are really slim for dealers, and they're in a competitive environment, so they're going to probably throw that cash on you, unless they're selling a Ferrari or something like that. I think that is where digital could really come in. There's been a number of trials by companies like Boston Consulting Group to actually try to figure out elasticity of spend, but they don't have enough data. And you guys actually have so many methods of doing pre-qualification, trying to figure out that elasticity. And it's not that you're trying to get elasticity so that you're trying to get them to pay more money all the time. What you're trying to do is figure out that sweet spot where they can produce the right amount of vehicles, get to the right consumer, and what is the spend. That actually is fantastic to look into right now. As we saw, the average income has gone down. We know savings are down, even though the economy is doing pretty well in a certain section, but other sections of the economy are doing very well. So for those of you that can actually dip into elasticity, that would be a really good piece of data to have. And I would just like to thank you all for listening to me about the exciting topic of incentives. I'll let you guys get back to your world. Thank you for having me.